Shara, in these exciting little future chat talks that we have, we've done a lot of information about, you know, what's happening and what's predicting and what our life after COVID would be like. But how do you go about predicting for, you know, two to 300 years time?
Well, that's actually a great question. I see another member of your family's chirping in the background. How cute. Well, when it comes to forecasting out into the far future, that's so interesting. I'm actually appearing on a television series called Life 2.0, which is airing in the United States right now. There are 11 episodes and I'm in 6 of them, and it's super exciting. And I got an email the other day from a gentleman in Connecticut who asked me the very same question about how do people even imagine what the world might be like in 200-300 years. I passed a farmhouse or a house that was built in 1728, and I often wonder, you know, whether they thought about the kinds of vehicles or things that might be flying over them. So I thought I'd divert from serious now futurist talk into some of the fun stuff, and that is, how do you go about making predictions that are really, really long term? And the first thing is that you have to make some very basic assumptions. And one of my assumptions for this little chat is that humanity is not going to face a disaster that is unrecoverable. In other words, we'll make it through this pandemic. We may be scarred and bruised, but in the end, we're going to come out and everything is going to be okay for us and humanity will continue on. So then we get to the how would you go about predicting a really long-term future, because that gets kind of hard. Well, there are a couple of things. First is looking back into history. And funnily enough, if you go back about 7,000 years, in the Indian text, they were talking about machines called vimanas, which were flying ships or chariots. You know, that was the term of the day. And even in the Bible, they talked about flying chariots. So it's something that has been part of the human imagination for thousands of years. You know, you look around, you see birds and insects flying, and you wonder, how might we do this? Very interesting. It was Leonardo da Vinci who designed the first helicopter, which from memory was like in the 1400s, where he sketched it out. But of course, it was many, many centuries later that a device like that was born. And well, not born, but actually designed and engineered. So there are some things that we can look at in history. But where I get a lot of my inspiration from is extrapolation of real hardcore science as well as science fiction. So hardcore science, well, even 10, 20 years ago, there was speculation about whether Earth was the only real planet anywhere in all the galaxies. We now have radio astronomy that has confirmed that there are thousands of exoplanets just in our own galaxy that are in what we call the Goldilocks zone, that is human habitable. So forget about other alien life forms. You know, we now know for sure that there are other planets. So that says to me, especially since we've designed reusable rockets, that there's a really, really good chance that in the future, we will be a multi-planetary, multi-solar system civilization. Our science is expanding in leaps and bounds. And literally, if we can imagine something, we are getting to the stage in our technology where it's getting faster, better, smarter, cheaper, all the time, and we already have reusable rocket ships. So this is not a science fiction thing. This is an extrapolation of current science. And then science fiction. If I look at Star Trek, look at how many devices literally came out of just that one television series. Think about the Star Trek communicators You know, this was back in the 1960s, and then Motorola had its StarTAC flip phone, you know, in homage to Star Trek. They had replicators. Well, the very first 3D printer had already been invented, believe it or not, before that. But there was nothing like a replicator where you could say tea, Earl Grey. We don't have teleportation yet. You know, we can't teleport from my house to your house. Gosh, I wish we could. We'd have to say socially distance, but you know, wouldn't that be nice to be able to get over the borders through teleportation? But believe it or not, a couple of years ago, Chinese scientists actually teleported photon particles up to a satellite in space about 1,400 kilometers away from Earth. So even that isn't quite as far-fetched as we might think. I like to look at some of the things that really great sci-fi authors have put together. Isaac Asimov is one of my favorites, and he was absolutely spot on about robots. And yeah, some of the things he predicted were not quite right, but the rise of robots is certainly something that is impacting our society today. Another author that I really like, and he's quite prolific, is Peter F. Hamilton. And he talks about quite a number of different futuristic scenarios, but in many of them, humans are highly, highly augmented, even with AI chips that are self-contained in our own bodies. We have abilities and implants to literally shield ourselves, protect ourselves, gain access to all kinds of archived memories, you know, from thousands of years. We have space travel, we have interplanetary communication with aliens. Another author that I really like is Ian M. Banks. He's Scottish, but sadly passed away in 2013. And he wrote this whole series called the Culture Series. And in that one, he had humans, or humanoids, I should say. It wasn't based around Earth or anything from our society, but he invented this whole society called the Culture Society. And in it, humans and aliens and super smart sentient AIs got along. Now, of course, there were conflicts. You know, you wouldn't have a good science fiction novel without conflicts. But there were various levels of technologies that were intermixed in the culture. And in them, my favorite characters were actually these little teensy-tiny drones that were super smart miniature AIs that had bigger than life personalities. I can't even begin to do justice to his works in this very short interview, but that will give you just a smattering of some of where I might get my inspiration for long-term sci-fi, long-term predictions based on both sci-fi and historical texts.
Wow. That's interesting. Yeah, it's, you know, we always learn from where we've come from. So it's important to keep learning, I suppose.
It is. And I think the critical element here is imagination.
Yeah.
And also the ability to look around in nature, and especially at the animal world and the insect world and the aquatic world, and you think, well, if an insect can fly, how come a human fly? Or if we have microbes that can survive in extreme conditions, how might humans be able to do it? It's curiosity, but it's also based on hardcore scientific facts and extrapolating them out, and also painting scenarios where, in my case, I've done a best case scenario where we haven't done anything really horrible to ourselves.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for that, Shara. Certainly some interesting content, and it goes to show that we are continually learning from our past, but also predicting our futures.
And hopefully people will have had a little bit of fun listening to this.
Exactly. And if you want anything, if you want Shara to cover anything in our future talks, then just message us and we'll cover them in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you, Liz. Great talking to you as always.
Thanks, Shara.